Sometimes people go into a coma, and when they wake up, it turns out that they somehow missed time. That's how my grandfather had it. He had a stroke and spent 3 weeks in a coma. I woke up, and then bam, I forgot the English language, only I began to speak choke. You know, Chok is such a local language there, or something. I used to communicate with the guys there. And so, when I was a child, I played with him, he talked freely in choke. But then I forgot, I lived my life, I couldn't remember a word. Yes, that's right, for about 10 days he didn't speak a word of English there, and then as soon as he woke up from a nightmare, he immediately remembered English, just without remembering anything on the choke. And, you know, I also found out about one dude who started speaking Cantonese after a coma. Well, then he tied something up with his Chinese woman. These are the stories, just unusual. And then there was such a thing. I was in a coma for 4 days myself, and when I got out, there was some kind of talk about my baby all around. I've lost my memory altogether, but it turns out I don't remember my pregnant wife. Our son was in intensive care, I didn't even know. And so, when I woke up, I couldn't breathe right away, the artificial respiration machine was on. Somehow I had to learn how to fucking breathe all over again. In general, it was scary, you know, to learn to breathe for yourself. Well, yes, and I also remembered about a friend who had sepsis after surgery. After the coma, his hair began to grow back, but his brain remained damaged. It seems that he was always in the slightest rotation, his head was spinning. But, thank God, he survived, even though he had to learn a lot from scratch. I also remembered an interesting story. I had a colleague at work, so the story happened to him too. In a coma, he did everything, he talked in a foreign language, like Spanish, and then, when he woke up, he suddenly forgot all the programming code, even though he knew it like a pro before. But the most interesting thing is that his memory did return, however, gradually. It was as if the puzzles in my head were all coming back to the right place. That, yes, it happens. And here's another thing that struck me. My grandfather was in a coma for a while because of a heart attack. And when I woke up, I suddenly started drawing, and before that I didn't even hold a brush in my hands. No one in the family knew that he could do this. It turned out that he seemed to have been reborn in a coma. I also remembered how one of my friends began to compose poetry after a coma. I had never been interested in this before, but suddenly I seemed to have discovered my vocation. And I have the saddest story I've seen in this thread. God, this is just awful. Imagine this, the person must have felt that this was punishment for something terrible. My wife was in an induced coma for 2 weeks for medical reasons. And when she woke up, she had false memories, all based on conversations that were going on in her room. For example, she thought she had flown to Washington for treatment while she was in a coma. My father told me how he had just returned from a work trip to Washington. And somehow she overheard it while she was passed out. Her brain somehow interpreted it so that she flew to Washington. Even after we explained to her the reality of where she was, it took several days for her to come to terms with reality. My brother-in-law had a brain tumor, so he was out for a while. When he was first taken to the hospital, the nurses were of Asian descent. So when he woke up, he apologized to people for making them come to Japan to see him. My friend's relative was in a coma for about 3 weeks. When he woke up, he couldn't find his teeth. Everyone completely forgot where they were put, they searched for a whole week. At one point, he collapsed at the hospital sink. Out of the blue, out of the blue. They resuscitated him, but they couldn't understand why he could barely breathe. Then the doctors showed the X-rays. It turns out that the false teeth were inside him, they forgot to pull them out when they inserted the tubes into his mouth, which led to a blockage of air access or something like that. So yes, they found the teeth. I was in a coma for 4 days from bacterial meningitis. When I woke up, I was completely deaf. I had to communicate with my parents and doctors using a notepad and pen. Somehow, gradually, hearing returned to the left ear, but the right ear still does not work 100%. My father had a reaction to contrast dye after a head injury. There were seizures, it was like a brain reboot. He could only pronounce, like a girl, my sister had just been born. He couldn't hold things, couldn't grab them. I spent several months in therapy. Eventually, his mood changed. He became very short-tempered, a little patient and very sleepy. He's fine now, except for some pain in his neck. About 20 years ago, my cousin suffered a serious head injury after a fall. He was about 20 years old at the time. He was in a coma for almost 4 weeks. When he woke up, he discovered pretty quickly that he had a perfect memory. He could recount any conversation word for word and even tell you the date and time when you said something. In addition, he could memorize an image in just a few seconds. His memory is still perfect. It's fucking annoying. Whenever he reminds me of something I've said in the past, it's usually something I can't even remember. I suggest we hit him in the head one more time. Looking at what happened the last time he was hit on the head, he'll probably just get another superpower. It's better not to risk trying to fix it. It just doesn't work properly. You need to turn it off and turn it on again. I had diabetic ketoacidosis and it eventually put me in a coma. I have vague memories of being sick. The general feeling of time was just like porridge. Even years later, I can't set the correct timeline. I have flashbacks of different doctors coming in and out of the room. As soon as I came out of the coma, I was still not myself. Once, on an insulin drip, doctors checked my sugar every hour. I could never fall asleep, but all the time I felt like I was asleep. It's hard to describe this feeling, just a mushy dragging time. I was in a coma for almost 6 weeks when I woke up. One day I went to the hospital and I hardly remember what the doctors and hospital staff told me. But the bottom line is that I was hit or knocked down on the road by a drunk driver in order to cross 3 lanes and get to the exit where I was. Basically, I was in his blind spot at the wrong time, and besides, he was very drunk. It feels like I've teleported or traveled through time, because 1 minute I'm driving, and the next I'm bleeding profusely, I'm in a hospital bed, with a brace in my back and neck, burns from airbag gas, and 4 in my arm and a few more injuries. When I woke up, I was in a completely different world from that one. So here I am, lying in the hospital, and the world around me just keeps spinning. I couldn't believe I'd missed so much time. Everything seemed so unreal, as if I had disappeared in time. Doctors, nurses, it's like in the movies. I remember being surrounded by questions, and I was confused trying to remember what happened. But the scariest thing was when I realized that I couldn't move anymore. At first it was like a nightmare when you wake up and realize that you can't move a finger. I remembered trying to convince myself that this was a dream, but the pain and reality hit me in the face. And then my struggle for every little bit of progress began. 3 weeks seems like an eternity when you can't raise your hand or take a step on your own. It was a time when every little move was a victory. I remember how I patiently trained, trying to regain some control over my body. But it was even worse to realize that a lot of my memory was gone. Like a painting smeared into pieces, my memories became increasingly blurred and inaccessible. It was like trying to put together a puzzle without some of its parts. And this is just a small piece of what I've been through. Coma is not just a waste of time. This is a test of survival, like fighting for every breath, for every movement. And when you wake up, you realize that you're not the same person you were before. But you know what? You're still alive. Some people, after returning from a coma, talk about strange memories and visions that they had during their state of unconsciousness. They could see bright lights or experience strange scenes that seemed real to them, but which they could not explain when they woke up. Incredible things happen in the world of medical miracles, and one of the most amazing is the ability of the human body to survive the most severe conditions, such as coma, and still return to life. For those who have experienced a coma, this resurrection can be no less amazing than the very state they were in. Many of them talk about the impressions and experiences they experienced after waking up from this deep sleep.